daughter's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. If a man lies with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall surely be put to death. They have committed perversion. Their blood shall be upon them. If a man lies with a male as he lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. If a man marries a woman and her mother, it is wickedness. They shall be burned with fire, both he and they, that there may be no wickedness among you. If a man mates with an animal, he shall surely be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. If a woman approaches any animal and mates with it, you shall kill the woman and the animal. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. If a man takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, and sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it is a wicked thing. And they shall be cut off in the sight of their people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness. He shall bear his guilt. If a man lies with a woman during her sickness and uncovers her nakedness, he has exposed her flow, and she has uncovered the flow of her blood. Both of them shall be cut off from their people. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, nor of your father's sister, for that would uncover his near of kin. They shall bear their guilt. If a man lies with his uncle's wife, he has uncovered his uncle's nakedness. They shall bear their sin. They shall die childless. If a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. You shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments, and perform them, that the land where I am bringing you to dwell may not vomit you out. And you shall not walk in the statutes of the nation which I am casting out before you, for they commit all these things, and therefore I abhor them. But I have said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the people. You shall therefore distinguish between clean animals and unclean, between unclean birds and clean. And you shall not make yourselves abominable by beast or by bird, or by any kind of living thing that creeps on the ground, which I have separated from you as unclean. And you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine. A man or a woman who is a medium, or who has familiar spirits, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. Amen. Well, as I said, lots of similarities with what has preceded. This prescribes the particular punishments or the penal sanctions that are involved in terms of the body politic relative to criminal activity in their land. So as I said, just a brief overview of chapter 20 and then a bit of a detailed treatment on the Bible and the death penalty. But first, notice the introduction. Again, we see that this is God commanding through Moses. This isn't the civil state. This isn't the judges. This isn't the priests or the prophets. But God spoke to Moses saying, again, you shall say to the children of Israel. So we always need to make sure that we ponder the reality that if we're anti-capital punishment, then in some respect we're anti-God, because God prescribes it here. Now again, there are some things unique to the Old Covenant nation of Israel that I don't think necessarily translate into the New Covenant situation, but the principle of capital punishment is thoroughly biblical. It is mandated by God, and as we find in the book of Numbers, it is absolutely crucial in the matter of murder. There is no ransom to be paid. There's no prison to be served. Rather, a murderer is to be executed by the civil state. So if we have a problem with capital punishment, or we have a problem with the death penalty in principle. Now, there may be some problems in terms of application. There may be some problems in terms of who's actually wielding the sword. For my own part, I'm actually kind of glad that Justin Trudeau has suspended that, or it's suspended presently in Canada, because I think that can open up a whole can of worms when political dissidents may be punished by the sword because of their wrongthink. So there are applicational issues, but the doctrine of capital punishment is certainly biblical. So there's that introduction where God reminds them who it is who is the lawgiver. And then notice in verses 2b to 6, you've got first table offenses, those things that are specifically against God. When you look at the Ten Commandments, typically we break them into two tables. You've got the first four, which is man's duty to God, and then you've got the last six, which is man's duty to man. So when we look at these first table violations, it shouldn't surprise us the things that are brought up. In the first place, we have the worship of Molech. Now that would certainly include all forms of idolatry. Any false god, any sort of Baal or Asherah or any of the pagan gods, that would be condemned. But Molech was especially nasty because what it involved was child sacrifice. The worshiper would bring their child to Molech, throw the baby up into the arms of Molech. The baby would bounce out into the fire that was at the base of that idol. And we see this already announced as bad and wicked in chapter 18 and verse 21. Here we see that it's a capital crime. It deserves execution on the part or by the part of the civil state for those who engage in this violation. But two things that are noteworthy in this particular section. Notice that the punishment is executed by the people of the land, according to verse 2. You see that in the principles concerning witnesses in Deuteronomy 17 and Deuteronomy 19 as well. And I think that would mitigate false witness or false testimony. If you knew you were going to be tasked with picking up stones to throw at your neighbor, probably somebody that you knew very well, you would want to make sure that you were speaking truthfully and you were speaking in order. So the gravity involved in this. So again, it's the people of the land, it's those children of Israel. It's not just the elders and the judges, but the ordinary citizens are involved in inflicting this penal sanction against Molech worshipers. But then as well, notice in verse 4, and if the people of the land should in any way hide their eyes from the man when he gives some of his descendants to Molech, and they do not kill him, then I will set my face against that man and against his family, and I will cut him off from his people and all who prostitute themselves with him to commit harlotry with Molech. Wenham, in his commentary, makes the good observation in terms of enforcement in the civil polity in Old Covenant Israel. We read through these lists and we see the capital punishments attached and we see the sanctions involved. And we might ask the question, how rampant were these crimes? I would suggest they probably weren't that rampant. When you knew from God through Moses, this is the way you were supposed to toe the line. When you lived in smaller communities, and pretty much everybody knew everybody, when you lived in smaller communities that were very conservative in principle and authoritarian, you had a theocratic system where God is speaking through Moses. So most likely, these crimes were not rampant. You know, when we look around in our own generation, people get away with what they can get away with. That's usually the way it goes. When you look at countries where there are strong laws against, say, graffiti, or strong laws against litter, or strong laws against whatever, and you know, they're cleaner environments. They're places where if you're a woman, you can leave your purse on a bus stop bench and go back 7 hours later, and it's still there. So people will get away with what they can get away with. And so when we look at these passages, it probably wasn't the case that they were off the charts rampant in terms of criminal activity. They probably had a pretty decent enforcement system, and because it was an authoritarian structure where God is speaking directly to them, where persons were very close in terms of proximity, it probably wasn't the case that this was an everyday occurrence where some new guy was being executed by the civil government. So when it comes to this particular prohibition against idol worship, notice again the language that is utilized there. At the end of verse 5, and all who prostitute themselves with him to commit harlotry with Molech. There is the temporal and the physical act of prostitution or adultery, but then there's that spiritual application. And God uses that language with reference to the nation of Israel when they go after other gods. It is to engage in prostitution. It is to engage in spiritual adultery. As Gill says, to go a-whoring after them, for to consult them, the idols, is to forsake the Lord, and have recourse to Satan and his instruments, to relinquish their trust in God and put confidence in them, and attribute such things to them as only belong to God, even the knowledge of things future. And this is to commit idolatry, which is spiritual adultery. And so that's the emphasis there, specifically with that first table violation. And then the second one is there in verse 6, we see the practice of witchcraft. Notice, and the person who turns to mediums and familiar spirits to prostitute himself with them, I will set my face against that person and cut him off from his people. If you look at verse 27, the chapter ends on that note as well. A man or a woman who is a medium or who has familiar spirits shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. I don't know why it's repeated. The chapter is very clear. You've got the introduction, you've got first table offenses, and then you've got an exhortation. Then you've got second table offenses, and then you've got an exhortation, and then you've got this last statement again that repeats the prohibition against witchcraft. Probably because the likelihood of them, when they get into the land of Canaan, is very high, that they're going to go a-whoring from God, and they are going to go after idols, and they are going to go seek out soothsayers, and witches, and warlocks, and necromancers, and all the things that the land has to offer. Because Yahweh doesn't answer in the way that you think he should, you might just go with your friend to the Baal services, because Baal, when he's prayed to, it rains the next day. So there might have been that pragmatism that God is heading off at the pass to try to tell them, don't turn that way, because that is an act of spiritual adultery. So after these first table offenses, you've got an exhortation in verses 7 to 8. Notice, consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. And you shall keep my statutes and perform them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. So it's not just them resisting the temptations or tendencies around them. It's not just them separating themselves from the heathen, but it's God at work in their midst that is cleansing them and sanctifying them and fitting them for his service. And then the text addresses second table offenses in verses 9 to 21. You've got the cursing of parents in verse 9, the act of adultery in verse 10, and then the act of incest all throughout the section, verses 11 and 12, verses 14, 17, 19 to 21. And then you've got the act of homosexuality in verse 13, the act of bestiality in verses 15 and 16, and the act of intercourse during menstruation. The emphasis there is on the act, okay? That is very crucial when we get into matters concerning the death penalty. Mind you, God will punish your sin. God will punish your internal problems. God will deal with you on at that great tribunal for every wicked thought you've ever had. The civil government is not supposed to punish sin. It's not supposed to punish wrong thing. It's supposed to punish acts of criminal behavior. We'll see that later when we move through Scripture and its treatment of capital punishment, specifically in Romans chapter 13. So what we have here is not persons thinking about this. What we have here is not persons in their closets, fomenting this sort of rebellion. What we have are acts of criminal activity engaged in by persons in the body politic, and when it is found out, then they are executed according to the rules of due process. There needs to be witnesses. Every capital crime needed 2 or 3 witnesses in order to prosecute that case. And so all those rules apply. Everything will be fleshed out later in the book of Deuteronomy in terms of due process and the way that you go, in terms of courts and higher courts, the Supreme Court, all that sort of thing is there. But when there is criminal activity, that criminal activity must be punished. So notice in verse 9, the cursing of parents. We've already seen that in 19:3. Notice, every one of you shall revere his mother and his father and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. So here we see the emphasis on execution for the child that engages in lawlessness at this point. So for everyone who curses his father or his mother. Now this isn't just the odd, crossword from Junior because he doesn't want to eat his peas. That's not what's in view here. This is an abject rebel against the authority of his parents. So verse 9, for everyone who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother. His blood shall be upon him. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 21. Deuteronomy chapter 21, where we see this in detail. And again, we need to appreciate this isn't your 2-year-old who doesn't want to eat his broccoli. This is an adult rebel son, an adult son that is a rebel against God ultimately and against his parents. Notice in Deuteronomy 21 at verse 18, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, So they've exercised parental discipline. They've exercised the pressure of loving discipline. They have worked with this lad. They have pressed his conscience with the law of God, but he will not heed them. Then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city. And they shall say to the elders of his city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. Now notice, he is a glutton and a drunkard. Again, he's not 5. He's not 8. He's not 10. He's not some little kid that didn't come home because he came home after the street lights were on. He is an adult rebel son. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. I've got 2 quotes here that I want to share. First is Gordon Wenham in his commentary on Leviticus 20. He says, the sanctity of parental authority implied by this law is striking when he speaks, or when we see in Leviticus 20, verse 9. Everyone who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. He says, the sanctity of parental authority implied by this law is striking, whereas in certain respects, Old Testament penal law was much more lenient than that of neighboring contemporary cultures. That's true. There's only one instance of punitive amputation in the Old Testament, and that's when a woman involves herself in a man, and men are fighting, and she grabs one of them by the private parts. Her hand is supposed to be cut off. The particular issue there probably has to do with seed, has to do with the ability to reproduce. That's the only instance of punitive amputation. The nations around, you cut their hand off for a whole host of things. So what he says here is right. Whereas in certain respects, Old Testament penal law was much more lenient than that of neighboring contemporary cultures, it was more strict with regard to offenses against religion and family life. Cursing father or mother is singled out for special censure, partly out of a determination to maintain the structure of the family. I like this part. And partly because the parents represent God's authority to the child. To curse them is almost tantamount to blasphemy. That's very important. We live in a decadent age in terms of parental authority and what parents expect from their children, and lawlessness and criminal behavior and activity on the part of kids. It's absolutely wicked. Vern Poythress, in a book called The Shadow of Christ and the Law of Moses, comments on that passage in Deuteronomy 21. Because as Christians, we hear that and we say, that's not right. Bring your son to the elders in the city gate and have them execute him. Okay, I'm not suggesting that we do that, one for one in the New Covenant situation, but let's watch ourselves before we start to engage in that kind of judgment about how right it is or isn't. He says the death penalty for wholesale violation of parental authority may seem harsh to modern sentiments, and I would suggest it most certainly does, outside the church and within the church. That's my gloss. He says, but I would argue that it is not only just, but realistic. Parental authority, even if very imperfectly exercised, takes place in the context of personal relationships and the natural pressures in the direction of love. Parents have many advantages over the state. If a person does not receive instruction from parents, the chances of receiving instruction from the state's more impersonal discipline are nil. The person who rebels in wholesale fashion against parents will also rebel against the state and create general destruction and disorder until eliminated. It is mere sentimentality to refuse to come to grips with this reality. Again, whatever we decide in terms of application of the fifth commandment and persons that curse their parents, I would just suggest we need to caution against this idea that, oh, that's just terrible. Well, I'm not sure what's more terrible. 18-year-olds and 20-year-olds on city streets where you can't even walk around at night for fear of getting mugged or robbed. I mean, if there was some parental authority exercised in Junior's life somewhere along the line, then maybe that would have been a great remedy for the situation that we now face. Notice, secondly, verse 10, the act of adultery. Again, we see the woman here is complicit. This isn't rape. This is a woman who is agreeable to this. So in verse 10, the man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress, that again shows that she's compliant, shall surely be put to death. That's something we see back in Leviticus 18, condemned. And then in Deuteronomy 21:22. And then the incest, we see it all over Leviticus chapter 18 as well. And we see the penal sanction attached here in chapter 20. And then the act of homosexuality, again, it's been condemned. And here we see, again, it's not a situation of rape. It's a situation where both partners are compliant. So if a man lies with a male as he lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. And then the last one, or the next to last one, is the act of bestiality in verses 15 to 16. Doesn't need a lot of comment. It is intriguing that the animal must be killed as well, probably because it's just a doubly unclean thing at that particular point. And then the situation with menstruation there in verse 18. This is repeated from chapter 18, but as well chapter 15. And chapter 15 envisages the man not knowing that this was the case. So there could have been an accidental case of this. And in that case, I think it's about 1526, the man is counted as unclean. So he's not executed if he makes a mistake. They're not executed if they're ignorant. They're executed if they, knowing the law, specifically follow a path that is prohibited and forbidden by God. And then notice the exhortation in verses 22 to 26, something we have seen before. You shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments and perform them, that the land where I'm bringing you to dwell may not vomit you out. Now, from the subsequent history, we know that that's exactly what happens. So God is not capricious. God is not arbitrary. He's not simply anti-Canaanite. When Israel goes into the land and they ape the conduct of the Canaanites, they get vomited out of the land. It's just that simple. So you can't say, well, that's not fair. God's going to just kill these Canaanites. Well, he kills Israelites too. When they engage in the same activity, when they follow the same pattern, when they go a-whoring from God, they reap the same consequences. That's how the book of Leviticus ends, basically in chapter 26. That's how the book of Deuteronomy ends at chapters 27 and 28. I know it goes farther than that, but the covenant curses cap off, covenant blessings and covenant curses cap off the covenant document. So this is not arbitrary on the part of God. The land vomits out wicked behavior, whether it be Canaanite or whether it be Israelite. And then notice in verse 23, you shall not walk in the statutes of the nation which I am casting out before you, for they commit all these things, and therefore I abhor them. But I have said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the peoples. Now notice, you shall therefore distinguish between clean animals and unclean. We go from capital punishment in cursing parents to capital punishment to bestiality, back to these laws concerning the diet. Remember, it was everything in Israel's life calculated to show them their difference from the nations around them. Their laws concerning penal sanction and their laws regulating their diet and their clothing and all that sort of thing. And then as well, I think we ought to notice is that when God calls them to live in a particular way, He doesn't leave it up to them to try to figure it out. He says, don't do what the pagans do. Sanctification and holiness, it ain't that hard, brethren. It's to obey what God says and to not do what the pagans do. So there's not this esoteric connection where I got to go seek the mind of God to figure out how to be holy in the land of the Canaanites. No, just don't ape the conduct of the Canaanites. Don't go after their gods. Don't go after their witchcraft. Don't go after their soothsayer. Don't do that. Just do what God calls you to do. So He doesn't leave it up to guesswork. It's not esoteric. It's not mysticism. It is clearly and objectively defined. And again, I think that goes a long way to help regulate the conduct in this body politic. When you know what the rules are, you know what the laws are, and you know what the punishments are for those, when all that stuff is clearly specified, I'm not suggesting it tames man's heart. I'm not suggesting it regenerates man. I'm not suggesting that it makes man perfect or it makes society perfect, but it goes a long way to exercising some degree of restraint upon a body politic. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Solomon alights on this. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. I think that, this is the principle that we see at play here. Ecclesiastes 8:11. He says, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. What's that mean? Well, it must surely mean that knowing if I engage in a particular crime, I'm going to be apprehended, I'm going to be arraigned, I'm going to be indicted, and I'm going to be punished. And if that never happens, then why not roll the dice and go out and engage in criminal activity? If the likelihood or the chances are that I'm not going to get caught, one, and if I do get caught, I'm not going to be arrested, but if I am arrested, I'm probably not going to get indicted, I'm certainly not going to get prosecuted. When there's that absence of restraint, you end up with societies that look very much like our own. Now again, the law is powerless in terms of changing hearts. It wasn't the case that everybody in the body politic was regenerate. There needs to be a mechanism in place that God has ordained for the restraint of evildoers at the level of civil society. And that's simply His law. And we ought to be about that. We ought to be pro-law in terms of the restraint of evildoers. We think, well, we can't save people, so what's the difference? Well, we can perhaps spare our children from being shot in the head on, Chilliwack Central because some gang, well, not Chilliwack Central, probably more likely to happen downtown because there's no law restraining it. So we need to be very careful about this reflex Christian attitude that says, well, that's just barbaric. I don't know what's more barbaric, the societies that we have created or the society that God spoke to here. Now, in terms of the Bible and the death penalty, there's lots to say. We're not going to say it all tonight, so we won't be too late getting to bed. But you can turn back to Genesis. Genesis chapter 9. That's the first place we look at. If we ask the question, does the Bible teach the death penalty? The answer is yes, the Bible does teach the death penalty. The Bible first teaches the death penalty in Genesis 9. And this is very interesting because Genesis 9 is not the Old Covenant. See, opponents of the death penalty will take a passage like Leviticus 20 and they'll say, well, that's the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant was fulfilled by Jesus. We're now in the New Covenant and therefore no death penalty. Well, that's bad logic, bad logic that we'll address as we move along. But the Noahic Covenant is still binding. The Noahic Covenant is a universal covenant. The Noahic Covenant is a common grace covenant. It's not a redemptive covenant. The Noahic Covenant sets the parameters in the earth for the preaching of special grace. In other words, God promises He'll never again destroy the earth. That means go therefore and preach the gospel and seek to make disciples. So the Noahic Covenant as a common grace covenant is still binding upon mankind today. There's no suspension of it. There's no obliteration of it. There's no removal of it. It is binding. As long as there's sun, as long as there's moon, as long as there's life on earth, the Noahic Covenant is binding. So when we come to the Noahic Covenant, we see very specifically a few things. It is, in the context, the post-flood situation. Go back to Genesis chapter 6 to see the pre-flood situation, or the pre-flood context. Notice in Genesis 6, 11 and 12. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So there's nothing new under the sun. Whenever you have sinners, you have sin. It's an impossibility. You're never going to have sinners and no sin. You're going to have sinners and there's going to be sin. So I said, the restraint of the law doesn't solve the problem, but it can imply some or levy some penalties against criminal behavior. But the world prior to the flood was corrupt before God. It was filled with violence. So what do you think is one of the marks of coming out of the ark? Establishing, as it were, a new world. Noah's functioning here as an Adam-like figure. What do you think would be important? Well, the propagation and protection of life. And that's precisely what you find there in Genesis 9. You've got propagation of life in verses 1 and 7. So notice in verse 1, so God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then in verse 7, and as for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it. Again, an Adam-like figure. Adam was given that mandate in the garden. The garden and the world, rather, pre-flood has been obliterated. Now Noah emerges from the ark with his family, and he's given that command to propagate life. Notice as well, he's given a command with reference to the provision for life. Notice in 2. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. So we've got the propagation of life, and we've got provision for life, and then notice the protection of life. The protection of life. Verse 2a, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth. That doesn't mean there'll never be a lion attack, but for the most part, the animals won't get you. As well, notice in verse 4, it says, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. I'm sorry, that's not the right verse. Protection of life. Yeah, you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. And then notice specifically verse 6, with reference to the protection of life. It's the death penalty. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. It's very clear. So whatever one says about the death penalty, we have to affirm that the death penalty is lawful for the act of murder. Okay? Is it lawful for other crimes? I would argue yes, but on a different level or a different basis. But you just have to appreciate verse 6 in Genesis chapter 9 in terms of universal in scope, common grace covenant made with all creation. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. So the offense is obvious. Whoever sheds man's blood, the unlawful taking of another man's life. Now, the Old Covenant, specifically the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy, make the distinction between manslaughter, which is accidental homicide, and murder, which is intentional, when there's premeditation, malice aforethought. So there is that distinction in terms of the shedding of blood. So here we assume, based on the penalty that is given, that this is murder, that this is an unlawful homicide. So whoever sheds man's blood, that's the offense. Notice the punishment. By man, his blood shall be shed. Okay, when it says his blood shall be shed, that means he must die. Because later again, in Old Covenant law, we see that the punishment must fit the crime. And we specify the punishment must fit the crime in what's called the lex talionis, the law of retaliation, or the law of retribution. The eye for eye, tooth for tooth, stripe for stripe, burn for burn, life for life. And again, we hear that language and we go, horror of horrors. It simply means the punishment must fit the crime. We'd all agree to that. Your kid that steals a Snickers bar out of Walmart should not have his hand chopped off. That should never happen to your child if he steals a candy bar at Walmart. Now, you should give him a good tanning. That's definitely necessary, or whatever the case may be. But he shouldn't get his hand chopped off because he stole the Snickers bar. The punishment doesn't fit the crime in that instance. But a man who goes into a school and, willy-nilly and arbitrarily shoots down and kills, 25 people in cold blood, that man should be executed because the punishment must fit the crime. Again, it's a principle of jurisprudence that we all agree upon, but when we see it in the Bible, somehow it's barbaric. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Again, this was published law. There was no question. There was no, I'm wondering what's going to happen if I poke that guy's eye out. You knew absolutely positively what was going to happen, and as a result, you probably thought twice before poking his eye out, because the squad might come and poke your eye out in retribution. So whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. So the punishment is his blood shall be shed. But notice the agent in the punishment, by man. It's not by God, it's by man. By man his blood will be shed. So Luther said this was the first command having reference to the temporal sword. By these words, temporal government was established, and the sword was placed in its hand by God. I think that's a good observation. Calvin says likewise, God so threatens and denounces vengeance against the murderer that he even arms the magistrate with the sword for the avenging of slaughter, in order that the blood of men may not be shed with impunity. In other words, there needs to be consequences when we emerge from the ark, so that we don't return to that situation that obtained prior to the flood, when the earth was exceedingly corrupt and filled with violence. There's going to be an agency now that has as its task to punish criminal offenders. And if that criminal offender is engaged in murder, then that criminal offender must give his life. That is just. That is the consequence. That's how we're going to do it in this post-fall world. Now notice the argument or the rationale. Verse 6, again, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. If we ask the question, the text answers. If we ask why, it tells us. For in the image of God he made man. This is why it is horrific to take the life of another human being. If you kill a dog today, you're probably going to be on the front page of the Progress. But you can kill your baby or your old people and probably not even make it on the back page. Now, I'm not suggesting we should just willy-nilly kill dogs. I'm not into that. I mean, if they're coming after you, yeah, it's either them or you. You got to win that exchange. But to just kill an animal, that's not good. But it's not murder. They're not image bearers. They're not rational beings. They're not created in the image of God. Man is, however, for in the image of God he made man. Voss says, in life slain, it is the image of God, i.e. the divine majesty, that is assaulted. Now, some argue that there's one of two ways to take this explanatory clause. For in the image of God he made man. Some suggest that's the reason for capital punishment for a murderer. Some others suggest that's the reason for the human agent that sheds the blood of the criminal offender. So in the image of God, he made man. So man, therefore, as the agent of God, functioning lawfully in as a magistrate, executes that judgment of God. Klein says this could explain both the enormity of murder and the dignity of man that justified assigning him so grave a judicial responsibility. So it either A, grounds the principle in the image of God as to why the man should lose his life, or B, grounds the principle as to why he loses his life at the hands of another man. For in the image of God, he made man. Either way, Genesis chapter 9, verse 6 teaches the death penalty for the crime of murder. Now, when we move from Genesis into the rest of the Pentateuch, when we move into the Old Covenant, you see some additional things going on in Old Covenant Israel. I've already mentioned one of them. It is the distinction between accidental homicide and murder. And probably a clear statement of that is in Numbers chapter 35. Numbers chapter 35. Numbers 35, specifically at verse 16. But if he strikes him, let's see. Verse 9, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall appoint cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person accidentally may flee there. It's an accident, okay? But it's an accident that he shouldn't do. And so there's this discouragement there. If you accidentally kill your neighbor, you're not going to be executed for murder, but your life is going to be messed with a bit. Why? So you learn not to do stupid accidents. So you make sure your axe head is tightly fastened onto the handle and it doesn't fly off and bury itself in your neighbor's head. Your life is going to be disrupted if you're a careless individual in the body politic. So it's not the crime of murder, but you are going to be inconvenienced to a degree because you were negligent and caused homicide. So it says, they shall be cities of refuge for you from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation in judgment. And of the cities which you give, you shall have 6 cities of refuge. You shall appoint 3 cities on this side of the Jordan. 3 cities you shall appoint in the land of Canaan, which will be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall be for refuge and for the children of Israel, for the stranger and for the sojourner among them, that anyone who kills a person accidentally may flee there. So there's accidental homicide. Okay, you're a reckless individual. You accidentally ran over somebody with your car. Okay, you didn't do it on purpose. You didn't gun it because you saw your enemy and you wanted to, let him have it. There's no malice aforethought. There was no premeditation. But you accidentally did that. You caused death to an individual by your own negligence. You got to leave. You got to leave life and happiness, at least for a time, and then you can come back. But notice in verse 16, but if he strikes him with an iron implement so that he dies, he's a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And if he strikes him with a stone in the hand by which one could die, and he does die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he strikes him with a wooden hand weapon by which one could die, and he does die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. The avenger of blood himself shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. He shall put him to death. If he pushes him out of hatred, or while lying in wait, hurls something striking at him so that he dies, or in enmity he strikes him with his hand so that he dies, the one who struck him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. So there's a distinction in the Old Covenant between homicide or accidental homicide and murder. It's not the same thing. When the Old King James says, you shall not kill, that's not the best translation. The sixth commandment prohibits murder. There are 3 instances authorized in the Bible for killing. There are 3 instances for justifiable homicide. One is self-defense. You see that in the book of Exodus, in Exodus chapter 22. The second is holy war. You see, or just war. You see an example of that in Deuteronomy 7. And then you see soldiers in the New Testament treated favorably. When they come hear the preaching of John the Baptist, he doesn't say, turn in your guns, get rid of your clubs, stop being a catapult guy. You can't kill anybody. No, he doesn't say that. He says, don't extort people, be happy with your wages, do your job. So, Cornelius, when he meets up with Peter in Acts chapter 10, Peter doesn't wag his finger at him and say, you got to put down your weapons. Stop leading troops into battle. There is a place for a military to defend the body politic. So killing in war is justifiable homicide. Now, what is a just and necessary war is another huge question that's very difficult to answer. But self-defense, just war, and capital punishment. If your job was an executioner in the civil government, that's a legit job. You can have that job as a Christian. Oh, no, horror of horror. Why not? Somebody's got to do it. You don't work much. It's probably good pay. I'm just kidding. But the bottom line is that it is mandated by God. In fact, if you look at the end of this chapter, look at what it says at verse 29. These things shall be a statute of judgment to you throughout your generations and all your dwellings. Whoever kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses. But one witness is not sufficient testimony against a person for the death penalty. Almost as if God anticipated, well, we can't use the death penalty because of the potential of somebody being an innocent victim. Well, it has to be 2 or 3 witnesses. There were no capital offenses. There was no death penalty apart from 2 or 3 witnesses. But then notice in verse 31, moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. And you shall take no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the priest. So you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. Therefore do not defile the land which you inhabit, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell among the children of Israel. So in the Old Covenant, in Old Covenant Israel, you have the distinction between accidental homicide and murder. As well, you've got the identification of additional capital crimes. So murder, Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. No dispute. Nobody in the New Covenant should ever say, well, that was an Old Testament Mosaic thing. No, not the Noahic Covenant. The mandate for capital punishment in Genesis 9:6 has never been suspended. It's never been abrogated. It's never been fulfilled. And if what God says in Numbers 35 is still applicable, we're in a bad state of affairs. We got a whole lot of blood guiltiness in Canada, a whole lot of blood guiltiness in America, a whole lot of blood guiltiness throughout the world. So identification of additional capital crimes. You've got murder, for sure. You've got adultery and sexual immorality, bestiality, homosexuality, rape, incest, the incorrigible son, again, not your 2-year-old who doesn't eat his peas, but the adult rebel son, Sabbath breaking, kidnapping, solicitation to apostasy, witchcraft, sorcery, and false pretension to prophecy, and blasphemy. So a distinction made in terms of what is murder and what isn't. You've got the identification of additional capital crimes, and then the declaration here concerning its necessity in Numbers 35, 31 to 34. Money cannot ransom a murderer. That murderer must be executed. Well, that seems a good place to stop at this point, and then God willing, next Wednesday night we'll pick up on what the New Testament teaches with reference to the death penalty. So I'll close in a word of prayer.